Morning, everyone, and welcome to this Saturday morning session. I'm very impressed that so many people are here to talk about the reform of the public services this morning. That's great. Welcome to this session, which is part of the Festival of Economics, which is part of the Bristol Festival of Ideas. I'm Heather Stewart from The Guardian and The Observer, and the topic this morning is reforming public services. Public sector reform, I think, is one of those phrases, a bit like hard-working families, that no politician is ever going to say they're against. Everybody says they're in favour of reforming public services. But even before the kind of age of austerity that we're in now, it can mean an awful lot of different things. It can mean full-blown privatisation, or introducing private sector-type disciplines or methods of management. It can mean trying to introduce more choice or diversity, which in itself can mean lots of different things. It can mean handing power down from central government in Whitehall to the rest of the country, or indeed hauling it back in again. And now, in this period where well into what's going to be at least a 7-year period of spending cuts, if not more, it's very hard to separate all of those issues from the effort to save money, which has come to sort of characterise what we're calling public sector reform. And it's also the case that while a lot of the recent efforts have been phrased as or couched as money-saving efforts, actually the most recent noises from the government, David Cameron's been saying recently that actually, even if we weren't in a period of austerity, he would like to see what he called a leaner, more efficient state. So we're here today to ask what's driving public sector reform at the moment, and what evidence is there from the UK and from other countries as to how to do it well, whether, what works and what doesn't work. And when we come out of this 7+ years of spending cuts, what kind of state, what kind of public sector will we be left with? This is all being broadcast, webcast, wavecast, I think is the phrase, live. So I'm to tell you that if you're listening or watching or whatever at home, you can join in the conversation using the hashtag #EconomicsFest. Obviously, if you're in the room, you can join in the conversation by putting up your hand. So we'll try and leave as much time as we can for audience discussion. We should have plenty of time for that. And we've got an excellent panel today to discuss all of those issues and more, I hope. To my immediate left is Paul Johnson, who's the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, respected tax think tank, as I'm obliged to call it as a journalist. Sarah Smith, to my immediate right, is Professor of Economics down here at the University of Bristol. David Hughes, on my far left, is Professor of Health Policy at Swansea University. And on my far right is David Walker, who's contributing editor to the Guardian Public Leaders Network. Is it fair to say veteran journalist, David, or is that... I mean that as a sincere compliment, but certainly has been writing about these subjects and issues for some time. Okay, so Paul, do you want to start? We're going to just have about 5 minutes, I think, from each speaker, and then we'll throw it open for as much participation from you as we can.
Thank you. I'll spend 5 minutes largely ducking all those questions. I think it's worth starting by reflecting on why we think about public sector reform or public service reform. The police really don't have much in common with primary schools, which don't really have much in common with acute hospitals, any more than various bits of the private sector have in common with each other. So I think just start, I think, if we're talking about such a broad subject as public sector reform, by recognising that we are talking about a very large bit and a very diverse bit of the economy. And I'll come back to that thought at the end, but I want to start with two thoughts. One, following on from what Heather was saying about what's happening in terms of cuts and the scale of the public services, and then a little bit actually on the workforce, because the large majority of the money that goes on public services goes on, obviously, paying for doctors and nurses and teachers and policemen and so on. So let me start with just the scale of the changes that we were just reminded about. Spending on public services is being cut by 1/5 in the period from 2010 to 2017. So £1 in every 5 that was spent in 2010 will no longer be being spent in 2017 on public services broadly defined. That is by far and away the biggest and longest period of cuts that we've literally ever seen in history by many orders of magnitude. And if you just look at those bits that are not protected, so if you take health and schools out of that, then the cuts are of 1/3. So £1 in every 3 that was spent on transport and police and defence and local government back in 2010 will not be being spent in 2017. So there are obviously kind of huge choices involved in that. And I think one of the choices that I've just alluded to, and if we're thinking about what is the shape of the public sector going forward, is a choice to continue spending on health and actually to continue spending on pensions at the expense of everything else. And that's a choice which is universally accepted among all of the political parties. And if you look at what this government is doing and what the last government did, they're going in different directions because they're working in different policy, in different financial situations, but they're making precisely the same choices. So the last government focused additional money on health more than on anything else. This government is protecting health whilst everything else is falling. The last government spent quite a lot in additional money for pensioner benefits. This government is protecting pensioner benefits. The last government was less generous than average on local government and on law and order and on defence, and a bit less on defence. This government precisely the same, though it's being a little bit kinder to defence relative to the average. So actually, in terms of the shape of the state, and not just this government or the last one, but the last 30 or 40 years, all governments have shown the same relative priorities pretty much. So where is that taking us in terms of the state and public spending and public services? Well, health and pensions now make up about 40% of all non-interest spending by government. Within the next 2 or 3 decades, half of everything government does will be health and pensions, and that's relative to about a quarter 30 years ago. So there's a massive, massive change over a relatively short period in what the state is actually doing. So I think that's the first bit of really important context if we're going to think about reform. Second thing I want to say, and this is separate, but it is clearly crucial to everything that we're going to be saying today, is this point about the public sector workforce. If you look at public service spending, workforce spending is about 2/3 of that spending. So that's a very large chunk of it. And so we can't really think about reforming public services without thinking about the workforce. And that, as you'd expect, given what's happened to total spending, is falling, and it's falling quite rapidly. The Office of Budget Responsibility expects public sector workforce to have fallen by 1 million by 2017. That's a cut of around about a fifth. Actually, the Southwest, looking at the numbers this morning, is seeing the biggest losses in public sector workforce as a proportion of the total in terms of all of the regions, the Southwest and the Northeast. So that's a huge change in the structure of the overall workforce. But I think it's also worth reflecting not just on size, but on differences. I think this matters between the public and private sectors. The private sector workforce is about 5 times the size of the public sector workforce. But the public sector workforce is a very important part of the overall story. And it looks very different in the way that it works and is remunerated. Wage patterns are very different. Female pay, particularly in the public sector, is much closer to male pay and much higher than female pay in the private sector. Now, that probably suggests something about the way the private sector is working. The distribution of pay in the public sector is much more squeezed than the distribution of pay in the private sector. There's much less geographical variation in public sector pay. And public sector pay is actually slower to respond to, as you'd expect, economic changes than private sector pay. At the moment, the government is squeezing public sector pay with 0% increases for most people. That's still playing catch-up with the big falls in private sector pay that happened straight after the recession. So that's one thing that's very different. Wage patterns are very different in the public sector. Second, and related to that, unionisation is much higher in the public sector than the private sector. Private sector unionisation, I think, is down to about 1 person in 10. It's very, very much higher than that in the public sector. And the third, of course, is that pension provision is very different in the public sector than the private sector. Defined benefit schemes are essentially dead in the private sector. They still cover nearly everybody in the public sector. So we've got a public sector workforce which is getting much smaller. And we've also got a public sector workforce which in many ways is becoming less like the private sector workforce. If you look 30 years ago, everything I just described, apart from the patterns of pay for women. Everything I just described is much more similar between public and private sector than it is at the moment. I think that's something that we'll be coming back to over time. And then finally, I just want to conclude by talking about, my first question was, why do we talk about reform of the public sector when it is this kind of whole range of different things which don't necessarily have much to do with each other? And that's clearly related to the way that it's publicly financed, that it's not focused on the kind of competition that you get in the private sector, and because it is so central to everything that we value and the way that we live. But I do think it's important to say that the answer for the police is not going to be the same as the answer for health or the answer for education. And just to put a framework around it, I mean, there are only a limited number of high-level things that you can think about in terms of your public sector reform story. There's top-down targets and control, tried a lot by the last government, clearly had some success in some areas, but clearly also created a whole series of perverse incentives which resulted in schools, for example, very quickly responding to whatever the incentives were provided. So as what counted as 5 good GCSEs changed, so the exams that kids did changed in response to that because of the way that schools changed their behaviour. So you can really affect behaviour, but not necessarily in ways that you want. You can improve local autonomy and increase democracy. A lot of actually what both the last government did towards the end of its period and this government is doing is looking at autonomy not in terms of democracy or local government autonomy, but autonomy for foundation trust hospitals or free schools or academy schools. So increasing autonomy has been a big part of the story. You can rely on professional trust. You say, well, we'll leave it to the doctors, we'll leave it to the teachers, and there's clearly an important role for that. But if you look 30 years ago, that's essentially what education policy was. And I think we do need to remember that simply leaving that in schools really didn't work. You can look at competition, and that's clearly, again, something that this government and the last has done some of, particularly in aspects of health. And important in all of this is accountability. How do you hold the public sector accountable for what it's doing? So I don't think any one of those is the answer. Each one will have some part of the play some part of the story in different bits of the public services. I'm now going to stop there without answering any of the questions. Hope that my fellow panellists will tell us which of those bits of reform will work where. Thank you.
Paul, thank you. That's really helpful kind of context and I guess sets out the kind of scale of what's going on in terms of reshaping the state. And Sarah Smith, do you want to?
I'm not sure I'm going to quite answer the questions either, but then I'm not the last speaker, so I guess the burden of responsibility falls mainly on them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of economic perspectives on public service reform. So I was really struck by what happened in Brazil over the summer. So there were some very large-scale protests. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets. So unemployment was low, youth unemployment was low, and economic growth rates were still relatively high. So the normal drivers of protest weren't present there. What people were protesting about, among other things, was the quality of the public services they were getting. They wanted better healthcare and education, and they wanted the government to do something about it. So it really was quite literally a very powerful demonstration of the importance of public services, how much people care about them, and some of the consequences of government failure to act. So I'm going to describe public services a little bit differently to how Paul was talking about them. He was focusing very much on the public sector, but actually I think what we mean by public services are the kind of the key services where there's an overriding case for some kind of state intervention, but not necessarily, a case for state provision or even state funding. There's a range of different models for the provision of these services across different countries, and increasingly greater diversity in the UK, so more kind of not-for-profit and for-profit organisations being involved in provision, and also a role for different types of non-state funding, for example, so there's more user fees in higher education. And I think if you're talking about the funding for public services, it's not only the money from government, but it's also, all the billions that come from donations to charity. So I think we want to think about public services in this very broad sense of being services that we care about, that are key to kind of welfare, where there's some kind of justification for state intervention, but not necessarily an overriding case for state provision and state funding, and there are other models of delivery. So if there's increasing pressure on state funding, what we really want to know is which of these different models work best. And as I said, I'm not going to provide the answer, and I don't know that we know what the answer is. I'm going to talk about some kind of research findings in a minute. But really, this is a festival of economics, so festival suggests sort of celebration. So I'm going to try and sort of celebrate, if that's not too strong a word, some of the kind of insights that economists have provided, on public services and public sort of service reform. And again, not to provide some answers, but to sort of help at least shape the debate. So among the leading lights in this area, I think, is the Nobel Prize winner Kenneth Arrow. So he wrote a paper in the early 1960s, which I think is still, incredibly relevant to the current debate. And the arguments he made are sort of still, they sound quite fresh, and they're still, it's still really worth reading when thinking about reform today. So the first point he made is that, these are services where the stakes are very high. The consequences of healthcare and education really matter a lot. But obviously, another feature of them is that people often have imperfect information. So they're making critical decisions, often lacking, complete information. And this combination of high stakes and imperfect information makes, in his words, signalling and trust really important. And in the absence of full information, in his own view, profit could be a signal that denies the trust relation. So, if you lack information as a consumer, you may not trust the for-profit provider to give you the best possible service. So we can probably come back to that later. His second point, so Paul talked about the workforce in the public sector. So Arrow's second point in relation to public services generally is that individuals involved in service delivery, the teachers, doctors and nurses, play a crucially important role. The quality of the services you get depends on the people who are delivering them to you in a large extent. So this is also true of many private services as well, accountancy and lawyers. It's just generally true of services, I guess. I guess if we're thinking about public services compared to accountancy and law, we may think that motivation comes into play. And we think that, we tend to think that in public services, the sort of public service motivation or the pro-social motivation of the key people delivering it might play a role in the quality of the services. His final point is that we care, these are things that we really care about people in society having, maybe unlike accountancy and law. Well, I guess not quite like law, but... But these kind of equity issues. We care about efficiency, but we also care about equity, and equity issues are very important in relation to kind of public services. In general, there's a willingness to support provision of public services for the population more generally through taxation, and also, taxes are compulsory, but people willingly contribute, charitable contributions to help provide these kind of public services in a broader sense. And I'd like to return to kind of public support for public services right at the end. So what have economists to say about the recent reforms in the UK? So at the University of Bristol, we have a leading research centre on public service reform that has produced some really important pieces of evidence. So I think, one of the problems in this area is it's huge reforms going on, really important questions. A lot of the evidence is kind of built up piece by piece by piece. So none of what I'm able to say kind of gives you the answer. But I think it's all important in kind of understanding the nature of the effect of the reforms that might be taking place. So first of all, Paul mentioned competition. So competition has been shown to improve outcomes in relation to health, but only if prices are regulated and hospitals compete on quality. So this goes back to Arrow's point about imperfect information. And if people can't judge quality and hospitals are given incentive to compete on price, then what might happen is that quality is eroded. When hospitals competed on price in the early 1990s, outcomes got worse. And the outcomes my colleague Carol Popper was measuring was, death rates. So when hospitals competed on price, more people died, her evidence kind of shows. So there seems to be a slightly different story in education, and the evidence suggests rather less effective competition outcomes, but partly because schools don't necessarily respond directly to competitive pressures in terms of growing or closing. But accountability measures do seem to be important. So there's quite striking evidence that the abolition of league tables in Wales, for example, led to a significant worsening of performance compared to England. Now, maybe this performance is in relation to the things that are measured, but if you do care about things, then targeting through accountability measures does have an effect. Another thing we've looked at is this kind of issue of motivation, and we found a clear link between motivation and organisational form. So what type of organisation is it? Is it a health service provided by a private organisation or a non-profit organisation? So we've shown that people working for non-profit organisations delivering public services put in more unpaid effort than people working in for-profit organisations. So we don't necessarily show that unpaid effort leads to better outcomes. So it's kind of we don't have the data to do that, but we do show that this idea that pro-socially motivated people will kind of will be found in non-profit organisations does have some empirical validity. And this comes about because individuals sort. So you could think people kind of change when they go to a non-profit organisation because it's a nicer place to work. Actually, no. Nice people, if we call people who are more likely to put in this unpaid effort, are more likely to move to non-profit organisations. And the people who don't put in the unpaid effort are more likely to go to for-profit organisations. So these kind of incentives kind of influence outcomes or at least input through a kind of selection process. So pro-social motivation is real and it matters, and it leads to more effort into kind of public service provision. This is not to say that pay doesn't also matter. So national pay scales have kind of meant that wages in some areas of the country are lower relative to kind of outside options in kind of health and education, and there's fairly convincing evidence that this has negatively affected recruitment, and this feeds through into worse outcomes. So there may be reasons for having flat pay structures, but that may have some implications. So I think these are kind of important findings about what works and what doesn't, and when things work and when they do not. But as I said, they're quite complex. Trying to evaluate whole-scale reforms is really quite difficult when you're trying to provide kind of hard evidence. I don't think these kind of research findings necessarily translate into kind of handy messages for politicians to deliver, but they're important in thinking about the consequences of the reforms that are put into place. Okay, so finally, I wanted to return to this issue of public support for public services. So I was looking a little bit at data from the British Social Attitude Survey, which has basically tracked levels of support for public services over 30 years. So basically people are asked whether they'd support higher taxes and higher public spending on public services, or lower taxes and lower public spending, or somewhere in the middle. So interestingly, the proportion of people who support higher taxes and more public spending on services since the end of the 1990s has fallen from around 60% to around 35%. So this has corresponded with general increases in public spending, at least over the first part of that period, so perhaps this makes sense. But I guess I'm interested in some deeper questions about whether decline in support for public services might translate or might arise from something more fundamental about more fragmented public services and possibly a more fragmented society. So another, final kind of, I think, insight from some economists, which is interesting and important in this area. So Alberto Alesina and Ed Glazer have argued that the greater the degree of heterogeneity in a society, the lower the levels of support for public services. In a sense, the level of caring that Arrow talked about may depend on whether other people in society are like you or not. So if you have increased income inequality or increased ethnic fragmentation, then actually you may care less about the fact that everyone gets healthcare and everyone gets education. So I don't have the answer to that. It's a kind of it's a hard question to answer whether the decline in public services is related to increasingly fragmented public services and increasingly fragmented society. But interestingly, if you look at the UK case, you can break down where levels of public spending public support for public services have fallen regionally, and the biggest declines have been in London. So it's which is the area which has probably become most unequal and most fragmented. So I think this is no means conclusive, but it flags an important issue. So another economist, Paul Collier, recently argued that we needed to think about the consequences of immigration, for example, not on demand for public services, but on the level of support for public services. I don't think the answer is to reduce immigration, but I think there are some big issues around how to sustain support for public services in an increasingly fragmented society.
Thank you, Sarah. That was fascinating. Very thought-provoking. David Hughes, I'll turn to you, my far left.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to narrow the focus and talk about the area that I know about, the healthcare sector, which is also one of the most controversial areas of public sector reform. There is quite good evidence that competition in certain circumstances can bring benefits. Findings from Bristol University and from the LSE suggest that hospitals subject to competitive pressures can, in certain circumstances, achieve better performance than those that are not. For me, though, there has to be a doubt about how much reliance to place on what are essentially snapshots of a system in transition. The NHS is changing rapidly. In the last 30 years, we've been subject to something almost resembling a Maoist permanent revolution. We seem to introduce one set of reforms, and even before they've settled, we've moved on to the next one. And findings from, say, the LSE study from about 2006 relate to an English NHS, which is rather different than the post-Health and Social Care Act NHS of today. So I think there is need for caution here. And in an ideal world, we probably wouldn't be looking at comparing different kinds of hospitals in a rapidly changing system. We would be trying to look at what happens in relatively stable systems over time and see if there are any patterns there. And I think in this context, international comparisons are quite important, that they can be useful both in showing how well competition versus integrated systems work, and also alerting us to the fact that there might not be one single reform trajectory. I think one risk with the policy discourse, particularly on the NHS in England, is that there is a perception that austerity has put us in a situation where we really have to change, and that market solutions are the sort of road we have to accept because of pressure on resources. But I think looking internationally, the picture is much less clear. In the 1990s, there were a whole series of reforms that involved internal markets and other new public management strategies that did seem to indicate a kind of convergence between systems. Many systems were going in that direction. It's not nearly as clear today. New Zealand, which was one of the bastions of new public management, abolished its purchaser-provider split in healthcare more than 10 years ago now. Sweden, whose county councils pushed quite a long way towards internal markets in healthcare, have radically watered down the harder features of that division in recent years. Countries like Denmark and Norway, which decentralized in the past and did introduce many new public management ideas, have moved back towards centralization in recent years. And of course, here in the UK, we have the examples of Scotland and Wales, which have both ended their purchaser-provider splits in healthcare. Now, in some countries, the rationale for doing this is largely about political ideology. It is about disease with the market. But in others, many policy commentators actually put forward an argument about affordability and the need to move back to a system that is simpler to administer and actually less expensive. And interestingly, there was a survey in the Health Service Journal earlier this year where chief execs of NHS trusts were interviewed about their views on the purchaser-provider split. Their support was surprisingly lukewarm, and many put forward the argument that it is actually quite an expensive system to keep going. If we look around the world at what lower and middle income countries are doing as they try and extend healthcare for their populations, we actually find that rather few of them are trying to do this through competition or internal markets. In the Asian region, which is one of my own research interests, countries like Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia are moving towards universal healthcare coverage using largely public systems and without a great deal of recourse to competition. The kind of cost containment mechanisms they are interested in are things like so-called closed-end funding, which largely means capitation, and primary care gatekeeping, rather than things like aggressive contract management or incentive-based arrangements like pay for performance. So I would say that the extent to which internal markets have a solution is really an empirical question, and you have to look case by case at what is happening. My own view is that reforms in any country have to build logically on what went before. And my worry with the reforms in England is that they do actually have quite detrimental effects on some of the things about the old system that were rather good. It's clear that economists had a big hand in the English reforms. The reforms are based on an economic regulation model. They attempt to create a market where it is easier for new players to come in and play a part. And they do try to build incentive structures into things like contracts that have rewards and sanctions. But it's always seemed to me that economic behavior is embedded in social relations. That if you're looking at healthcare, you're looking at commissioners who are securing the provision of care within long-term trading relationships rather than in a spot market. And those relationships, those relational networks are very important when things go wrong. It's long been recognized in economic sociology that social relations have a smoothing function in economic markets. My worry about what is happening in England with the extent of reform, the extent of dismantling of some of the previous structures, is that the old relational networks that came to people's rescue when trouble arose are being swept away, as is much of the organizational memory. And in that system of new structures, I'm not quite sure that economic incentives alone are going to be enough to keep people on course. So I would predict choppy waters ahead for England myself. Okay.
And when you say social relations can have a smoothing effect when things go wrong, presumably you mean that if your local doctor knows the hospital that they're commissioning the care from or whatever, they can, and something goes wrong along the line, they know the chap at the hospital to talk to and they can sort it out. And that's far harder if they're trying to choose from a bank of different...
Well,
is that kind of example of what you...
The main example would be relations between primary care trusts in the old days, clinical commissioning groups now, and their providers. That,
right.
When finances were difficult, when they had to wrestle with payment by results, tariff-based contracting, they might do deals that slightly bent the rules just to keep things on track.
Yes, yeah. Okay, and finally I'll turn to David Walker. I won't say you're going to sum everything up, David, but...
No, on the contrary, you'll have to
jolly good.
You'll have to forgive me, Heather. And indeed, the organisers of the festival have to forgive me, because although it is an economics festival, maybe economics as a mode of approach, particularly to public services, isn't altogether up to it.
Ooh.
I am, in part of my life, a non-executive director of an NHS trust, the Central and North West London. And among the things we do, we provide school nurses in the London Borough of Hillingdon, part of the community services that we provide there. And I went recently to visit a team of school nurses visiting a school who were administering to the girls in a couple of year groups HPV, human papillomavirus vaccination. And they're also trying to pick up girls who might have missed MMR when they were younger. Now, that function could be, and indeed might be, in future provided by Virgin or Circle, because competition, of course, is a good thing. It reduces costs. And in terms of the rubric for this session, as Paul's mentioned, there is greater pressure than ever for public services to be more efficient as budgets are cut. But school nurses employed by Circle or Virgin would, by definition, be self-interested. The point of competition is to further your own interests and, crudely put, do down your rivals. So, why should a competitive school nurse worry when a tearful pupil confides in her about problems at home? Or an attentive school nurse notices signs of anorexia in one of the girls she's vaccinating? Competition dogmatists might say, well, no problem, you can write into the contract incentives to liaise with GPs or social services, but of course, that's a nonsense. A nurse is drawing on her clinical experience, because most of these school nurses are women, and see that this girl's problems need to be taken further. That girl is best counselled privately, and deal often with essentially ambiguous ethical questions within the bounds of their clinical knowledge. A Ricardian nurse, however, would make this calculation. What's in it for Virgin PLC if I bother to contact the girl's GP? A Schumpeterian nurse would say, let the girl's problems fester, and we could have an orgy of creative destruction, out of which might come entrepreneurial opportunities for us to seize. Now, public services have in recent years had to contend with, if I may put it this way, in deference to my academic colleagues here, the imperialism of economics and the triumph in public policy of a reductionist mindset, conscripted often into the service of a neoliberal anti-state ideology. Worse, and this does shame the economics profession, empirical evidence has often been ignored in favour of abstract demonstrations of the benefits of competition, following from tendentious a priori assumptions about human motive and behaviour. And if I may very briefly give you an example of that from health, again, before quickly fleshing out my broad contention. It's a paper which could stand for many, and it's perhaps unfair to pick on it, but I will, it's a paper by academics called Brecchi, Siciliani, and Straumer, and it's called Hospital Mergers, a Spatial Competition Approach. Brecchi happens to be a professor at the Norwegian School of Economics, which may also say something about the penetration, even into social democratic countries, of this particular mode of approach. Heavily influenced by the United States of America, like so much of what David Hughes referred to as the new public management, this paper assumes treatment is delivered and can be costed in a unitary fashion, an assumption that clearly contradicts what we often experience as patients, which is what is often called comorbidity. We have several conditions at once, and indeed the lived experience of patients in their interaction with primary care and hospitals. The paper concludes, unsurprisingly, that commercial hospitals based on price, as increasingly they are in the NHS, will raise their prices when there is less competition. Ergo, the more competition between hospitals, the better, provided, of course, we assume away, as the authors of the paper do, any questions about how you travel to health facilities and access care. Any cultural considerations are not in the picture, such as a community's affection for a particular hospital, or even more critically, who actually makes the choice in health matters, whether it's the patient's carers, or under the advice of, or often by, a primary care doctor. And of course, we have to assume, as the economists say, elastic capacity to pay, which of course isn't the case when payments are made by third-party insurers, let alone when, as 49 million Americans prior to Obamacare found, they couldn't even afford insurance. Now, I referred to a reductionist mindset. Let me give you a brief example. The authors of this particular paper, and I think, again, they speak for many economists, cite studies finding, quote, that market concentration significantly increases mortality. Now think about it for a minute. That's a clinical nonsense. Would you rather be operated on by a heart surgeon who, in a dispersed, unconcentrated health market, gets to do an operation a week, or a surgeon in a concentrated, i.e. specialist unit, who is doing a dozen procedures? I won't labour the example, except to note in passing two characteristics of this new public management thinking. One is the way it individualises public services, as if they were consumed in the same way, remember that favourite phrase of Margaret Thatcher, in the same ways as we consume groceries from Marks and Spencer's. The other is a kind of unitisation, so the analysts of hospitals talk of quality as if it were a single thing, instead of a complex phenomenon that often can't be aggregated out of a myriad interactions between clinicians, ancillary staff, patients, carers, and so on. Now, let me wind up with some unvarnished, crude points, crude for the sake of, I hope, an argument. Contractualisation in public policy is the stepchild of economistic approaches to public service. And for all its popularity, there remains a dearth of empirical support for the contention that all bringing private contractors in does any more than shift a little way on that curve which links or trades off between quality and cost. In other words, you can reduce the cost by bringing in circo-inversion, but there's a quality consequence, as indeed we are seeing with various services at the moment. The new public management, American in style and assumptions, and propagated often by economists, usually ignores questions of power, constitutions, political procedure, and the other trappings of citizenship, and ultimately, I fear, is anti-democratic, fomenting the mistrust that contracting of public services feeds on. Competition is often a dogma undermined by the lived experience that we have in private markets that are, we find, uncompetitive, and from the public's point of view, if I can use the economist's word, monopsonistic. From the water with which I this morning brushed my teeth, and the train that took us to Bristol, competition is nonsensical as a characteristic in collective service provision, and many of the services on which we depend for civilised life are inherently collective. Reform has become a ramp for more private provision, advocates of which, and I'll end here, suffer from a dual myopia. They won't see that private providers have an incentive to contaminate politics and policy making for the sake of their commercial advantage, which is why even as the state is shrinking, the intensity of lobbying of politics has been growing. Private provision implies contracting works okay when in fact it's shot through with objections, the most obvious of which, Susan mentioned it earlier, is information asymmetry. It's not venality that explains why G4S and Serco are accused of ripping off the Ministry of Justice over tagging, but the built-in condition where they have more information than the people who let the contract, and will, according to economists' own modelling of rationality, have a standing incentive to use their superior information, in other words, to abuse it. I conclude with this question. Would you rather be operated on in a competitive hospital where the surgeons believe in de Broglie equilibria, or the hospital which messily strives to live up to an ideal, yes, an irrational, value-rich and permanently disequilibrated ideal of care?
Thank you, David. That was thought-provoking, to say the least. I'm very keen to throw it open. I just feel I ought to allow Sarah to respond to the idea that economists shouldn't even be involved in this sort of area of policy making. It's, economic thinking is just not the way to approach these questions, which seems to be precisely the opposite of what you were arguing earlier.
So it's very interesting. David referred to a number of papers, but I think there are certainly other papers in the economics literature which exactly recognise the trades-off between cost and quality, which he was referring to. I don't disagree with much of what David said, but I'm an economist, so either I'm not an economist or David's wrong in attacking economists. So I'm not quite sure which is the right conclusion. There's a paper, very famous economics paper where they point out that if quality is non-contractable, so if there are aspects of care that you really are concerned about, those are kind of additional extras in care that David was talking about, the reassurance provided to the young girls, then you don't want to contract it out because, what the for-profit will do is go for the lower cost at the expense of that non-contractable quality. But that seems to be an insight that is well recognised by economists and has been written by economists. So, as I said, I'm sort of struggling to quite understand whether I'm just not an economist or whether David has not read everything that economists have to say on this topic.
I think economics is particularly dangerous when placed in the hands of politicians. Isn't that part of the problem? Isn't it selective use of ideological interpretation of a particular...
I don't want to hold up contributions from our audience, but I do feel as a discipline, for example, I will cite the nature of the work done by successive recipients of Nobel Prizes in economics. The essential nature of your discipline has more conduced to this approach, which I've characterised as pro-competition, than that more pragmatic evaluation of different approaches that you mentioned. So structurally, I fear economics, particularly in its North American manifestation, and that's been the dominant trend in the discipline for a long time now, has underpinned an approach to public services which many of us fear is detrimental to public well-being.
I think I'm going to leave that hanging in the air and throw it open and see what the audience thinks. There's loads to go out there on the size of the state and the styles of reforms and support for the public sector and so on. There's one right here.
Yeah, hello.
Do you want to tell us your name before you...
Yeah, Ted Fowler. I'm a public servant with about 40 years ago, an A-level in economics, so I may be talking rubbish.
Eminently qualified in that case.
Part of my work is about contracting services for public benefit. But actually also a big part of my work is designing those services with the people who are going to benefit from them and the people who might be providing them.
Can we ask what sector, which business?
Well, I work in economic development.
Right.
So, it's quite complex, but it's probably marginal, so we're probably out. But never mind. I've also been involved in education and various other areas of public interest for a long time. So this is kind of a reflection on the issue. To me, it seems that we've really got the language wrong. I think it's a policy issue. Policy people are talking about citizens as consumers, as customers of public services. But actually, it's the state institutions or whoever else that is paying, with taxpayer money, that are paying for public services. So it's the state that is the customer. And what really is happening is that the state institutions, people like me, whoever, are trying to aggregate a sense about what values we want to procure for people in our area of interest. And the whole point about where people are is being lost. They're seen as victims, consumers. I'm involved in education. Education is now seen as something that is consumed by parents and children for their benefit alone. Actually, we all pay money, tax money, for education. So I think that society is the beneficiary of education. So society has a broad range of stakes in the value of education. So instead of thinking of it as something that is consumed as customers by individuals, maybe we should be thinking instead of how we actually work in education, how we actually work in health, and that is by producing our own health and each other's health. We work by making a better life, by being connected, by contributing. The citizens of this country, of this city, contribute to our economy. They don't get it, they don't consume it, they contribute to their own health. It's not given to them. The way we work with expertise isn't a one-way service down, or whatever you might want to call it. It's a process that involves lots of parties as individuals and collectively. So when we talk about the way in which services are consumed, we're missing the point about how we actually create benefit in our economy and how we create benefit in public service. I don't know if that was a clear
David
response.
Hughes, does that speak a bit to some of what you were talking about how kind of economic models map onto the way that public services work, that you miss certain things? Do you think if you characterise the person turning up for a hard operation as a consumer, do we miss something there?
I think the difficulty lies in a political discourse rather than in economic thinking as such. I mean, it shouldn't fall to me to defend economists, but there are quite sophisticated analysis of principal-agent relationships which would look at the possibility that the state is acting on behalf of the general public. What you said suggested to me the difference between a consumer good and a public good. Education, many would say, is a public good. It's not an aggregation of individual purchases, as it were, by consumers in a marketplace. But some of the current debate associated with the particular reforms do conceptualize the people who will use the services as consumers. In Wales, Julian Tudor-Hart, one of our long-standing commentators on the scene, talked about the need to make sure that we listen to the reasoned voices of citizens and not the shrill cries of a consumer. And I think he was railing against this kind of characterization of the users of education services as individual customers, as well as what goes on in the NHS.
That is very much how we are being encouraged to see users of education at the moment, isn't it? I mean, with the idea that once you're stumping up your $9,000 a year, you're more likely to prod your lecturers and demand, rate them on websites and demand different behaviour from them and so on. I mean, that's very much how we're being encouraged to see it, isn't it?
Yes, certainly. And at my own university, we now have computerised assessment of lecturer skills, which completely bypasses the lecturer and might have quite adverse consequences if enough customers said that their performance was no good.
Dear, that sounds very alarming. Should we take another question? There's one here I can see.
Hello, I'm Martin Emmett. It's a question for Paul, actually, and it's a statement of fact, and I think you might be able to answer it quite quickly. You said since the recession, the pay in the private sector had fallen a lot quicker than pay in the public sector. What sort of figures are there over the whole economic cycle, so not just in a downturn, say over the last 10, 20 years between the two sectors in terms of pay of the people working in it?
If you look over long periods, the pay tends at the median tends to go at a fairly similar rate. So
that's the person right in the middle of the population, isn't it?
Exactly. So sort of the average worker, as it were, in the public and private sector has probably over the last 30 years seen, and I don't have the numbers precisely, but probably seen a relatively similar level of change. But if you take the end of 2007 to now, you'll actually see a bigger fall in private sector pay than in public sector pay because there was such a big fall in private sector pay very quickly, and the public sector pay is kind of gradually catching up, as it were. And that you see you always see that in the relationship between public and private sector pay over cycles. Private sector pay tends to respond very quickly, and then public sector pay will catch up either from below or from above.
And private sector pay has been unusually weak in this downturn, hasn't it, even relative to previous?
Yes, I mean what's been happening in the labour market over the last few years is incredibly unusual. I mean, and in some senses, I mean, this may sound like we should be incredibly pleased about the way that the labour market has behaved. If the labour market had behaved like it did in the 1980s, unemployment would probably be twice what it is now. What's happened instead is that everyone's had a bit of a pay cut, and we've had many fewer people made unemployed. What happened in the 1980s is most people got quite big pay increases, and we had a very, very big increase in unemployment. If you think what's happened to output this time, it went down by more, and it has stayed lower for longer. And so what we've actually had is quite a shared experience of most people having a bit of a pay cut rather than a significant minority being chucked out of work for long periods.
I mean, is it worth adding, I mean, there's obviously a danger in comparing between public and private sector that you follow the Daily Mail in making an error, which is to compare the workforces as if they were the same. I mean, you have to be aware that as services have been contracted out, particularly services provided by manual workers, the composition of the public sector workforce has become more managerial, and managers tend to get paid more. So I think it's important to observe that. But also, and this point tells against the public sector, comparisons sometimes neglect the way in which within the public service there are automatic annual increments separate from any annual settlement. Now, figures can often pick that up, but it's something that is sometimes below the radar.
Yeah. But I think the ONS figures, the national figures, have just recently started to show quite significant falls for the public sector, and that's partly because although they've had these pay freezes, yes, people were moving up those sort of annual increments, but most people have now reached that ceiling, I think, after this freeze has been in place for 3 years. So there are some quite severe cuts going on now, I think, to pay in real terms.
Public pay is really, and it's again, it varies. I mean, if you're in the central civil service, it's really bitten very hard, and it's but in other areas quite hard. And I think this point about the sort of different composition is important. It is astonishing when you look at the figures. It is now the case that half of all public sector workers have got university education, compared with less than 30% in the private sector. I mean, it is an incredibly high educated workforce in the public sector. I mean, all nurses and doctors and teachers and a lot of the administrative staff and so on. Very, very different from the private sector, where you don't have anywhere near that level of education. It's partly because it's more sort of you need qualifications to do an awful lot of public sector jobs in a way that you don't formally need them in the private sector. It's another example of the way these sectors are diverging in quite remarkable ways.
But it's also presumably because at one time the cleaners in the hospital and the people who provide the lunches in the hospital, whatever, would have been public sector workers, and now they're more often than not contracted out.
There's a bit of that, yeah.
Right, let's move to another one. There's a lady in the front row here. Sorry, I'm giving you the runaround with the mics there.
Hello, Alison Butcher, ex-NHS manager, although I'm not going to comment at this instant on the mess that they've made of the NHS. Do you not think that whatever the rhetoric, actually the impact of what is increasingly privatisation of public sector is to actually de-skill, deprofessionalise, lower the pay and cut pensions, and that is actually what it's all about. And that on top of the actual reduction in money going into public sector, for the companies that are now going to take a profit, then actually you are actually getting a second cut on what is actually being spent on applied care.
David Hughes, do you want to take that one first? You're a resident health service expert.
Okay. I'm sympathetic to your point, and I thought I would link this to something that Sarah said earlier about Kenneth Arrow. Kenneth Arrow is still alive, as far as I know, and as recently as 2009 updated his classic account of market failure. And he says that the market still doesn't work properly, but there is something that supplements the market. And the thing I want to stress are the elements that put a non-economic influence on the market. And he talks about professional skills as one crucial input into this, but says that the big problem we have now is an erosion of professional standards, a decline in trust, a dismantlement of this dimension. And so there may be a kind of double cut, but there is also a further attack, if you like, on the fabric of how the economic market is embedded in a set of social relations.
And David Walker, did you want to?
It's been interesting, I mean, as the problems that are confronting Serco particularly and G4S have unfolded, one's had statements, I mean, you probably never read the second, I mean, Heather does every day, I'm sure, read the second section of the Financial Times, which has company detail. But in there, over the past week, there have been, to me, fascinating revelations about the approach taken by these large contracting companies, where in their conversation with their shareholders, as they've tried to explain why they're in this difficulty with the government, they've basically affirmed that their model is exactly as you put it. And once upon a time, you heard from companies like Capita that they didn't just do it on price. They could come in, undercut the public sector on price, and increase quality. Now we're getting the admission in public from Serco and G4S that it's all about cost. What they come in and do is reduce the unit cost of labour, i.e. pay people less, and they employ fewer people. When it comes to, for example, there was focused in one of the papers, a custody suite in Newport, so somewhere just across the Severn. And G4S had reduced the number of people employed in the custody suite from 4 to 2. And if these people acknowledged if there was a problem with the prisoners, they would have to immediately appeal for assistance from the police, obviously in the assumption that there would still be enough police bodies around to come to that. But the economic model with which they were working was simply one of reducing the number of people involved, and hence the potential quality of the service was bound to deteriorate.
So I was just going to I guess the background is possibly a situation where money had to be saved. So, if you were looking for cost cutting, then it seems to be sensible to go for those areas where you think that the quality risks are lowest. So contracting out some of the basic services like cleaning or catering where you don't think the quality consequences are so important are perhaps the areas to go for. I think one of the problems, actually a point that David raised, is about the problems in the public sector actually managing and dealing with these contracts. I think that is one issue in economics that we don't possibly consider, the transactions costs and the issues around, designing and implementing and managing the contracts. And I think that's possibly been one of the real failures in the whole process.
Okay, which can be costly in itself. Did you want to come back quickly? Yeah.
Just wait for the mic. Yeah.
I actually was Director of Commissioning for a while. It is impossible to write a contract. As David explained, you don't write a contract that says to the school nurse, when you're doing job A, if you notice B, C and D, please do it. Take care of those issues, which in the current, or in the old system, would automatically have been done. To write a contract to cover those sorts of events will, A, cover thousands of pages. No one will be able to track it. And it is an impossibility, and that is one of the major problems of the whole thing. Never mind the sheer transactional cost of writing contracts, putting them out to tender, that has now, under the new NHS system, become ludicrous. Aided and abetted by Monitor coming in and saying you can't do these things because of competition or not competition or whatever.
That's where those accountants and lawyers you were talking about earlier come in, isn't it, I think? There's a chap in the middle here. Oh, there, maybe? Yeah, it's the one, this one coming from behind you, I think. Oh, yeah, lunge over that way, that's it.
Good morning, my name is Nick Gargan. I'm the Chief Constable here in Avon and Somerset Police. And I'm wrestling with the things that Paul talked about, 20% reduction in workforce by 2018. And I'll just make 3 comments, which have probably got questions in there somewhere. The first is, David talks about lived experience, and our lived experience in policing, that example of custody being one he just gave, is that actually one of the reasons for outsourcing is that the people who come in, be it G4S, Serco or whoever, tend to do things better than we do, and they manage resources better. And actually I don't want to have 4 people sitting on their backside in a custody office waiting to get busy. I'd rather have 2 Serco people in there and everybody else out on the streets, and we'll backfill afterward if we suddenly have a busy spell in custody, because it's not always busy in there. So our lived experience is that bringing people in the very small proportion of areas where we do bring in private sector partners tends to be in areas where they'll do a better job than we can do.
And why is that? Why could you not do that yourself? Why could you not say, actually, I think we can do this with 2 blokes and we'll get the other 2 out on the... why can the other public services not able to do this themselves, do you think?
There's a combination of the people we recruit, the things that we prize in our appraisal systems, the places we put our best people. I want my best people in investigation, solving murders, etc., etc. Inflexibility, the inability to bring people in at a senior level, so everyone's come up through the same way by and large. And it's just the limitations of our workforce as it stands. We probably could do something about that, but I'd rather set the ability and creativity of my best people with different challenges and just let Serco, Capita and others do that. And that's the reason organisations like Capita have grown to about 60,000 people, because they do things that we can't be bothered to be good at. The second observation is that is in relation to this complex information that Sarah described. And I think one of the things we should be really alert to across the public services is the differential impact. You know, I know policing well and know that this force is in reasonably good shape. You know, we will be able to take the cuts that are coming our way till 2018, and there is no risk to our viability. But others, because of their size, their indebtedness, their funding arrangements, their governance, and police and crime commissioners are in a much more dangerous position, and I think we should be collectively paying more attention to the fact that this isn't falling evenly. You know, we're all flies heading towards the windscreen, but some are going to hit it much sooner than others. And then the third thing is just, I think, something that I was expecting I might hear something about this morning, but haven't, is the potential to generate scale through a kind of collaborative approach across public services, through integrating public services. And I'm interested in the panel's views on the fact that it seems to me that's a very promising approach at a local level.
What kind of thing do you mean by that? Police working more closely with health authority, say, or...?
I'm thinking about, if you go to Weston-super-Mare, there used to be 8 public sector front doorsteps leading onto the high street. There's now 1, it's the library, and you can go there to borrow a book, you can go there to report a crime, you can go there to pay your housing, etc., and actually that drives the cost down. So if you're taking these big amounts of cash out of public services, being able to integrate in that way seems to me a very sensible thing to do. But it feels like, you know, some of the policies of the most involved government departments, the communities and local government and Home Office, the policy of localism tends to neutralise the levers and the incentives that might make that easier to bring about.
Right. Lots of interesting things to go out there. Is anybody who would like to... David,
well, I mean, where we live in London, our bins are emptied by a French-owned company called Veolia, and I have to say they've worked on behalf of Camden Council for a number of years, and most people, Labour councillors, citizens, people at large, are satisfied with that service. Nobody's making a dogmatic statement. I'm certainly not saying all contracting is, by its nature, problematical. It's, as someone said a moment ago, it's when you approach what you might call human services, difficult interaction with people, it's there that specifying a contract becomes difficult. Now, maybe running a custody suite isn't difficult, although I would imagine there are going to be circumstances where the people running it will need to be very sensitive to problems of potential violence and so on. And again, I refer to the report about Newport. It was striking that the police always had to be there as a backup, which did put a quite strict boundary around the potential for contracting. And to just, I mean, briefly, a point about scale, yes, but be careful what you wish for. I mean, the government, and it's not a problem confined to the United Kingdom, has a major problem with defence contracting. Why? Because in defence contracting, there is a single supplier, effectively. If you want to build a ship, if you want to build armaments, you've got to go to BAE. There's no other company. Go too far down the road of agglomerating services into one provider, and you run into problems of ensuring you have some data with which to compare performance. But, so in passing, your point about a single front door for public services, you're absolutely right. Localism is the enemy of effectiveness in the delivery of many public services, I fear.
Because it means that those different bodies don't work very well together, you mean? They're all...
Well, they have an incentive not to, because, Weston-super-Mare, Bristol, other districts in the area, because they feel their identity is bound up with providing their own services, won't have any wish to collaborate.
See, I think David's an economist after all.
Oh, dear.
I mean, he's kind of articulated, I think, exactly what is the issues around where contracting will and won't work, and for things like rubbish collection and so on, where the public sector hasn't had a great record, where the contracting is relatively straightforward. There is right across the piece. There are lots of examples of things that have worked well, where it's become more efficient. The Chief Constable, I think, is exactly right. There are a bunch of things which, because of the way that bits of the public sector work, haven't been done as efficiently as they could be. But there are also huge examples where this has been catastrophic, and exactly where, sort of in a sense, economics would tell you they will be. The biggest is probably the public-private partnership in the Tube, system, which was an absurd sort of farrago of contracts which would have reached from the floor to the ceiling many times over, and entirely predictably collapsed at huge cost. And that that kind of thing, anybody could have told you, and indeed did tell government, would not
because it's too big and too
work.
complex.
Much too complicated. And it was trying to. I mean, it was hundreds of millions of pounds spent just on the contracting, because there were so many bits in there where you say, well, if this, then that; if that, then this, and then it was one of them was contracted to a supplier who was subcontracting only to itself and other members of that consortium, and which kind of collapsed under its own sort of contradictions in a kind of Marxist way, I suppose. But it was I mean, there are examples of that which have wasted really eye-wateringly large amounts of money. But there are also, I mean, let's not forget this, there are also examples of huge state failure. Not North staffs in terms of hospital care, and other examples of failure to deliver on the state side, which are of equal magnitude. And the issues are often the same, which is what is the best way of getting the right outcome and motivation and so on from the people and service deliverers involved. And that it certainly doesn't always involve contracting with the private sector. It doesn't always involve doing it through top-down direction from the public sector, and it does require a sensible issue-by-issue understanding of what will work. And I do think the one place where I do agree to some extent with David's initial kind of statement really is I do think there is a kind of that there is too much in the public sector and among politicians of a sort of economics 101 about this. What do you learn in your first year of economics about what works, and you kind of understand about competition and so on, and then that's immediately taken from there into, well, let's do something in the public sector because competition always works. If you do much serious research and study in economics, that's not what it's about. I mean, you start there in year one, and then the next 10 years are kind of undoing it and kind of understanding about where and how and so on. I think part of the problem with the public discourse is it's just become much too simplistic, and can be used in damaging ways. But I think the truth is there have been huge examples of catastrophic failure, both in direct public provision and in the kinds of contracting that David has mentioned that I've just described, where those are, sadly, were actually entirely predictable ahead of hand.
Okay. There's another one in the middle here.
Thanks. I'm Alan Carpenter. I'm an ex-NHS chief exec. I'm going to add to some of these points, and really the point that David made in particular. I think one of the issues I see is that when we talk about this debate, we talk about public and private. And often we gloss over things that are good in the public sector, particularly the NHS, which I know best. So, for example, the issue of relationships. In my experience over the last 20 years or so, some of the most key things that happened were built on long-term relationships, particularly bearing in mind the point that these things are often also built on wider networks, so that good health is also about good social care, about good links with the police force or with education and so on. So actually, as Alison said earlier on, those things are really difficult to contract for, probably impossible. But if you have really good relationships and really good foundations to build on, which often don't get articulated properly in these comparisons that are often crude, you lose all of that. And even simple things such as reducing 4-hour waits in A&E, those rely on quite sensitive, quite delicate, often long-term discussions and relationships. It's not just about contracting with a hospital to do it. It requires discussions with GPs and with the ambulance service, and so on and so on and so on. So actually, my key point is that when we talk about these comparisons, we reduce into public and private. And the really good things about the PCTs 4 or 5 years ago get lost in the apparent certainty of the private sector.
David Hughes, that's very much what you were saying, wasn't it?
Well, it was, and much of my own research has been qualitative research where I talked to NHS managers or sat in on many contract meetings. I've heard very similar accounts to yours very many times, and it's actually nice to have a first-hand statement of that in the meeting.
And there's one in the front row here. Sorry, you're getting lots of exercise, aren't you? I'm sorry about that.
Mike Thorne. One of the things that concerns me most about the changing nature of the public service is the unequal impact that has on the population, the consumers, taxpayers, whatever we want to call ourselves, because of our inequalities of economic and political power. So that most of the people in the audience here have got relatively high amounts of economic and political power, so we can use choice to get favourable outcomes for ourselves and our families in schools and in hospitals and so on. There are then huge swathes of the population that don't have that power, that in the old days would have a local hospital or a local school that they could rely on. Now they don't know where they're going to go and get pushed around. And that also is a feature of the workforce, that people with high economic and political power working in local authorities know where to go to get good jobs, and they know where to go when things go wrong with disciplinary and grievance procedures and so on. What is happening now with the privatised public services is it's not just one remove from local authorities with contractors. There's a second remove that's really scary with agencies, and quite a lot of the contractors out there are using staff from agencies on zero hours contracts, and scant facilities in the way of rights, employment rights, and so on. So there's a horrendous picture, I think, developing of unequal provision that is going to require, I think, a growth in advocacy and support services to help the people who are going to be most disadvantaged by all this change.
Sarah, you talked a bit about support for public services when you've got a very, diverse society, didn't you? Is that?
Yeah, so I think the gentleman's making a different point about, so this is sort of also linked to the issue of whether you should treat individuals as consumers. So I think if you have a very consumer attitude towards the people who are using public services, then you're treating them as people who are able to make decisions with perfect information. That is clearly not the real situation that many people are in, making decisions about public services, where they're incredibly important decisions that people are making without perfect information. I mean, even if you give them a league table, that's not quite the same thing as having perfect information about kind of public services, and you don't really know how it's going to turn out until quite a long time after the decision is made. It's just not like a regular, it's not like buying a dress or something. It's a very kind of different type of decision, and that has to be reflected in the way public services are delivered. So and I think, that's again, where economists who are interested in, really thinking through how these markets are working are showing that, school choice is associated with kind of, the kind of what you'd expect in terms of unequal outcomes between, more advantaged people going to the best schools, and that's kind of in the data. I think the point I was kind of making at the end was more about sort of underlying public support for public services in fragmented societies, rather than, I think, your point, which is about the impact of choice-based systems on outcomes for individuals, which I think is a really important issue and something we should be looking at in kind of more detail. Just what do these choice-based systems mean in terms of people's access to different types of services and the outcomes that they get? Because, as we said, that these public services are different. You can't really just treat people as consumers in the same way as you would for private market goods.
David Walker, did you have thoughts on that?
I think we're addressing, again, sorry to sort of bring it back to sort of the purposes of the festival, which are great, but the limits, if you like, to an economic view of the world, in talking about power, in talking about the distribution of goods and services and fairness, talking about relationships, and talking about how people get on in so many dimensions of their lives. Bringing an economic perspective to bear is wrong, because it never can get to the rich reality of how people actually interact. Now, far be it from me to say on this occasion that what we are lacking is a sociological perspective, but I fear that's the case. Just let me briefly go back to the Avon and Somerset Constabulary example. Now, it may be that you could secure a more efficient and effective delivery of police services if, for example, Avon and Somerset were merged with an adjacent constabulary, Gloucestershire, for example. I would imagine, however, that the people of Bristol and the people of Gloucester and Cheltenham might have strong views about the nature of the organisation which policed them. Those feelings are not really susceptible to economic analysis, and I don't think economists would pretend that they are. And what we lack, I suppose, is a kind of disciplined approach to understanding how people think about their lives in a fuller and rounder sense than just in terms of markets and market efficiencies. And I think one of the things we're uncovering this morning is the importance of bringing an economic approach to many phenomena, but the limits of that economic mindset.
Controversial territory. Right, there's a gentleman here in the second row.
Thanks a lot. My name's Gavin Smith. My field is or was transport planning. And the main point I was going to make is I think there's a growth of elitism within the concept of work. One current example is the way nurses now have qualifications, but quite a few of us would think they've ended up being worse nurses. That's public debate at the moment. In my own field, in public transport, I was around in London when the King's Cross fire occurred. And we happened to be the organisation that found out that the reason the King's Cross fire occurred was because the contract sweepers weren't doing a decent job sweeping the fluff underneath the elevator. And in my normal work as a transport planner, I'm sort of aware that unless you know the mechanics of engineering, I mean, I'm a transport planner, not a civil engineer, but unless you have a range of concepts of all the job, and you're not going to get a good outcome. You'll not actually make sensible planning decisions. Whereas there does seem to be a concept that you can split jobs. You can have the clever bit at the top, a nurse with qualifications. The stupid bit at the bottom, you can contract to sort of somebody on 0 hours contract, probably from abroad, have no rights whatsoever, and they can do the cleaning, and that's okay. Well, actually, it's not, because you end up with hospital disease. So I think there's a problem with the way we look at work. And my main point would, I suppose, be that in public services, the relation that's really important is the one between the worker, the provider, and the user, the consumer. And that's the main thing that needs attention. That's where things really happen. And it's the one that's left out.
Okay. Does anyone want to come back on that? Should we take another one? I think that's really interesting. It was a sort of point rather than a question, but it was a very good one. Should we take this lady on the front row?
Listening to you talk about the decline of the public sector employment with women, it really struck me that I think women, by and large, do carry the support for working collaboratively and cooperatively and are much less enthusiastic about competition. And it seems to me that, as a woman, I think we somehow need to get together to really advocate the importance of collaboration, cooperation and relationships, because actually those are the things that make organisations work well. Competition, in my experience, often gets in the way of serving the public.
And there are also, again, things that are quite hard to capture in those contracts or those procurement agreements or whatever. Collaboration.
But, I mean, there is a problem. I mean, you obviously gather I'm, broadly favourable to public provision, but we have to accept simply to trust professionals, whether they're transport engineers or clinicians in the NHS, is itself problematical, because that would imply that they're never likely to misbehave, they're never likely to abuse their professional power, they're always going to serve the public interest. And I'm afraid experience says that broad generalisation doesn't hold. So we have to devise some mechanism to subject people who have professional knowledge to some degree of accountability without allowing that mechanism to interfere with their proper exercise of discretion in their job, so they can make a rounded judgment based on their knowledge. And I fear we have, with the new public management, swung to one extreme and saying we can't ever trust them, we've got to subject them to market tests. But clearly we can't move and shouldn't move to the other extreme of saying let public service professionals get on with it without any degree of accountability. And I think one of the intellectual tasks we all face at the moment is finding some medium whereby we can allow professionals to do their jobs, but do them with a degree of accountability to the citizens and the democratic system.
I think it's incredibly important. I think it's exactly right. And the gentleman at the front talked about, as it were, in the good old days, you could rely on the local school round the corner. Well, you couldn't. You absolutely couldn't. And I know that because of my own experience. And that was exactly for the reason that David pointed out. There was no professional oversight or accountability 30 years ago in the school and education system. There were a whole range of schools which were failing for a long time, and it's actually only over the last 10 years that the accountability system has resulted in some of them, including my old school, closing down because it had been failing for a long period. And without that accountability, and as Sarah was saying, without the league tables in Wales, which didn't provide the accountability and actually resulted in a measurable decline in performance, you're not going to get the good quality that you want. But David is absolutely right. You need to do that with the professional freedom to make those decisions and the professional ability to run a good service. And I think he's exactly got the sort of knocked the nail on the head in terms of what we need, the balance that you need to achieve.
Okay. Through the wonders of technology, a question has popped up on my little iPad in front of me here. It's a rather specific one. It's from Vera Michelle, and it's very specific, in fact. It's in which sectors would contracting out improve public services, efficient delivery and quality, and when would it lead to failure? I think you've talked a bit about that, Paul, haven't you? It's not, presumably you wouldn't say it's a specific sector. It's to do with the kinds of organisation involved, the kinds of projects involved, the complexities of it, and so on. Do you want to?
This is a trade-off which kind of economists have kind of thought about, and so anywhere where there's high levels of non-contractable quality are the types of services you don't want to contract out, because as the lady said,
non-contractable quality is these kinds of things you've been talking about,
the
these
kind of the
intangible
things that you care about that you can't write into a contract, then you shouldn't. Or if you do contract on these services, then there'll be a trade-off between cost and quality. You might get something cheaper, but at the risk of lower quality. If I could add something. So it's interesting, this is part of a festival of economics. So I think my main takeaway from this is that a little bit of economics is a really dangerous thing. So one of the answers might be no economics, but another way forward is to actually get people to undertake a slightly deeper study of economics, because a lot of these issues that have come up, which are exactly the ones that economists would kind of recognise. So, this idea that there's a trade-off between cost and quality, and that if you just contract out something to a for-profit organisation and it's an area where you care about this non-contractable quality, all those extra bits that you can't write a contract around, then economists would tell you you'll get a worse quality service. You might get something more cheaply because that's what the for-profit organisation will care about, but the quality will go down. But that's not, that's not a consequence of economics. That's something that economists recognise and would try and deal with. Also, they would recognise that that the public services aren't like kind of sort of many market goods, and that also, if you start to introduce profit motives, then you may also crowd out some of the motivation or lead to a reduction in the motivation among the people working in it. So, as I said, I do take that a little bit of economics is a very bad thing. It gets very misused, I think, by politicians and has been used as a kind of justification for a lot of things that they've implemented. But actually, I think if you kind of push economics a bit further, I think that, we're not kind of... we do actually recognise a lot of the issues that we've been discussing today.
Unfortunately, politicians like their economics clean and neat.
As I said,
it's all rather messy, all these things we've been trying to discuss. That's part of the problem, isn't it?
If you forgive me, we don't want to have a debate about the essential...
I'm going to let everybody come back and then we'll have to wind up.
Economics. But let me, if I may briefly make this point. In the Nobel Prizes awarded in 2013, the leading Nobel Prize for economics went to a man who said, there is not and can never be a recession. Eugene Farmer of the University of Chicago believes in something called the efficient markets hypothesis. People always know enough to know enough. There can never be a situation where, in this instance, demand would fall without there being compensation.
Although the other recipients were people who picked holes in that theory,
one contender for the Nobel Prize this year was a British economist, a distinguished man called Sir Tony Atkinson, who spent his life studying one of the characteristics of our kind of society, which is mass poverty. He spent a long time understanding the nature of the distribution of income and wealth. It's interesting that, as it were, the top of economics still belongs to those like Eugene Farmer who spent their life in the service of capital markets, rather than those like Tony Atkinson who've actually spent their economic wherewithal in trying to understand poverty.
Although one of the other winners was Robert Schiller, who said, markets can create crazy bubbles and get completely out of control. I mean, there are different strands.
Is at the top of his profession.
He is at the top of his profession. There are different strands in economics, and you're right. Some of those are in the ascent. Some of those are in the ascendant. Does anyone else want to? Paul, you wanted to say something before we close up?
Well, I just wanted to. In a sense, David clearly is correct about a number of his observations about what economics doesn't do. But I think I guess my question for him is really, why is it that the other social sciences... So you're right, clearly there are important sociological and psychological and other issues that one needs to take into account. And economics, not even the most sort of imperialist of economists would think that economics has the answer to everything. I think that it has a contribution to make. But I guess the question is, why is it, in a sense? And it appears that the other social sciences haven't had such a big impact, actually, on the kinds of debate that we're having. And I think they've had too little impact. And maybe in the 1960s, sociology kind of had the sort of more imperialist role that economics has at the moment. I don't know. But I'd be very interested in views about why it seems to be that actually, in my view, there's been a bit of a failure of some of the other social sciences, not necessarily intellectually, but in their impact on policy and in the public debate and in the way that they're put across. And there seems to be a gap there, and maybe economists have moved too far into that gap because it's there. But I'm just interested in the question as to why that gap seems to exist.
That could be a whole other panel discussion lasting another. David, did you want to say anything else? I'm going to have to wind up because we're
yes.
slightly over
Well,
time.
Paul raises a very interesting point. I don't want to rise to the bait too much, but I am old enough to remember when sociology did have a big share of the funding, and it was then elbowed aside, probably largely because it did not produce definitive answers and clear timescales in the way that economics did. I'm thinking of a time when the Social Science Research Council was renamed as the Economic and Social Research Council, and when many of us lost our jobs or had to accept pay cuts. That happened to me a couple of years after Margaret Thatcher's election victory. So we can't really go into it, but there is an analysis of this. I could perhaps point Paul to a couple of interesting articles.
Well, I think I'm going to suggest that you two discuss that afterwards. But I think it's certainly the case that economics has a kind of a slightly dangerous clarity about it sometimes. It seems mathematical, it seems very clear, it seems very sharp, and that's very appealing to politicians who want an answer today. So I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. I think it's been great. We've gone right from the kind of details of contracting out and of policing and of hospitals to some very appropriate for a festival of economics, some very kind of high-level discussions about the nature of economics and so on. And I think we should all take away what Sarah said, which is that a little bit of economics is a very dangerous thing. So perhaps we could thank our panel in the traditional way: David Hughes, Paul Johnson, Sarah Smith, and Paul Stewart.
Thank you very much. And can we also thank Heather? Heather's from The Observer, and The Observer are one of our partners in the Festival Ideas and the Festival Economics. So thank you very much. There's a break now for 45 minutes. If you're coming to the next session, you're welcome to stay up here. The cafe's open downstairs. The Arnolfini bookshop at the back has books by speakers at the festival, and I'm sure they'll be willing to sign those books if you'd like them. And if you're staying for the whole day or would like to come back, we're launching a new series today, Perspective series of books about economics, that's edited by our programmer, Diane Coyle. And you're welcome to join us for that book launch about 7 o'clock tonight with drinks in this building. So thank you to the panel again, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.